Hello friends, this is Ganesh and video number 17 on object-oriented ABAP. In this session, I'm going to explain the concept called exceptions in object-oriented, and this is going to be two videos. The first one, I'll explain about what is exception, how to raise an exception, how to capture it, what are the different ways to capture, and different ways to we can able to pass a message to the end user. So all the basic stuffs about exceptions I'm going to explain on this. And the second video, I'm going to explain how it is designed for object-oriented ABAP. So if you start learning exceptions, you might see in a diagram or called CX root is the base exception class in object-oriented, and there are three inherited classes underneath. One is dynamic, static, another one is check. Okay, and after that we have to create all our custom classes. Even all the standard classes has to come under any of these three inherited exception classes. So once you're comfortable with the first one, how to create an exception, I'm good with the exception, how to create, how to capture, how to understand, then the design of the design of the exception in object oriented is very easy to understand. So that is the way I have keep these two different videos on this concept. Let me get into the slide. So the first one is exceptions, about exceptions. Now, normally exceptions, if it is exception, normally we have seen a short dump. Okay, so it's like something is not expected at the runtime, because if there is any compile time error, you will get a syntax things, and those things captured in the compile time itself. Something is not captured because mostly it depends on the value which we are receiving is not unexpected at the time of runtime of the program or application. Then obviously it will raise an exception. Okay. And exception, if you raise an exception, it needs to be captured properly, and there are some proper information to be delivered to the end user. So saying that, so this is the reason this is the value which we received. So because of that, we are not able to proceed further. So some relevant information to be message to be reached to the end user. So that is what it needs to be captured. And about the calling object, I'll just come to the hierarchy. And normally to avoid an unusual situation in the program flow, so there is a program flow is happening, and very simple example, divided by zero. If you take divided by zero, and what happens, it goes to a short dump page. As an end user, they're not aware of what is happening in the program. So to avoid those kind of situation, we have to capture the exceptions at least in some places and give a proper message. So that means we have to avoid the unusual situation if we capture it properly. Hierarchy is a very important area of exception. So hierarchy means you can divide like level 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of. So for example, in level 1 I have a program, and level 2 I have a method, class and method, and inside the method there is an exception has been raised. Take a simple example of divided by 0. So there is an exception is raised inside the method, and what happens that is in level 2. So either the exception to be captured in level 2 or at least in level 1. Okay, if none of the places the exception is not captured, obviously it goes to a dump. So it can be a multiple levels also. If the exception is captured in level 4, it has to be captured either level 4, the exception is raised, then it needs to be captured either in the level 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, at least one of the level, the exception to be captured properly. If not, definitely it will affect the flow of your program or an application. Okay, so that's why the hierarchy is very important. So make sure the exception to be captured in any of your levels. And then some technical details about exceptions. So we call it as exception class, meaning if you want to create an exception, it needs to be in the form of a class. Okay, C24 or a local class. So it needs to be a class, and that inside the class you can have the message, whatever informations you want. You can proceed further. So the first step would be, if you want to create an exception, you need a class. You have to create a class, and type of the class is exception class. So far we have created a public class, private class and everything. So here also same thing, public and private, but there is an option. Normally we create a normal class. Now we are going to create an option called exception class. Okay, and The source class of any exception class should be CX root. Okay, and another one, maybe the next point I have covered, the naming convention of any exception class in SAP is it should be start with CX. If it is a custom, it should be ZCX or YCX. Okay, so CX root is a source class of all the exception class in object-oriented ABAP. And exception object. Okay, so if you create an object for an exception class, then that object is technically called it as exception object. Okay, it's not a normal object, it's an exception object. An exception object is created whenever there is an exception occurs. Obviously, meaning I want to access some messages, access some methods of an exception class, then you need an object. Okay, it depends. Actually, this is optional. Without the exception object, you are able to capture the exception also. I will explain those things. But if you want to access anything from an exception class, definitely you need an object. That object is called exception object. Okay, and that needs to be created only whenever the exception is occurs. Otherwise, unnecessarily, no need to create it. And exception object attributes carries the information. Exactly. The object has its own parameters. It carries the message whatever you have to deliver to the user. So you need an object if you want to access anything inside your exception class. And a block, this is a very familiar block for you. Try, catch, and try. This is a block which we are going to use to rise, or if you're going to capture any exception. Normally not for rise, actually to capture an exception, we are going to use try, catch, and try block. Okay. And then syntax. So to raise an exception, you need a syntax called rise exception type exception class name. It could be a custom or it could be a standard, depends on your scenario. And then to capture an exception, so you need a try, and I'm going to try a statement. It could be a method, or it could be a direct statement like divided by 0 or overflow of the particular data type, whatever it is. So that particular statement to be added over here. And catch, the exception is catch exception class name, whatever name which we used to raise an exception, the same exception class name to be over here. And into exception object, this part is optional. If you want exactly, okay, for example, I don't want access anything from exception class. Once I capture the exception, I'm going to give my own statement, right, this is the one, or message, this is the one. Then this part is optional. But sometimes what happens, I want the exact message what is returning from this exception class, then you need an exception object. Okay, so exception object creation is optional. If you require, you can create it, otherwise just ignore it. Catch and end dry, and you have one more option called cleanup. Probably I will take this cleanup in the next video. And then what else? Yeah, prerequisite of creating any exception, custom exception classes. There is an interface if underscore message. We have one more also, if underscore message underscore t100. So those it will come automatically, but at least this interface to be included in your custom exception class. And a custom exception class is always an inherited class. So I already mentioned the first, maybe the first slide, all the custom and standard class are to be inherited from any of the three classes. It could be either dynamic or static or no check. Okay, and one more point, you are not able to inherit directly from CX root. CX root is the base class, and then you have three more inherited classes. Underneath, you can create whatever class you want. And a global exception class namespace must be ZZX or YCX, otherwise you will get an error. You are not able to create any exception class without this namespace. And this is applicable for only for global exception. Local, you can create whatever name you want, but only global, it should be ZZX and YCX. Then you can add whatever name you want. And scenarios, what I'm going to explain in this session would be, I'm going to raise an exception without a quote, obviously it go to shorten. And I'm going to raise a standard class exception with and without message classes. So without message class means I'm going to generate my own message, and with message class I'm going to receive whatever the proper message is maintained in that standard exception class, and design my own exception class, and same thing, custom exception class with or without message classes. So this is the scenarios which I'm going to cover today. And then, yeah, this is the diagram which I'm talking about. This is going to be detailedly, we are going to see this do's and don'ts, and which class we have to choose for our custom class, everything probably in the next video. And this is a very basic design of exceptions in object-oriented ABAP. CX root is the exception class, the base class, and then uh, there are three classes which is inherited from the CX root: static check, dynamic check, and no check. And you can choose any one of this, depends on your scenario. You have to choose it and create a custom exception class. Okay, so this is about the exceptions and syntax and everything. So I'm going to explain the scenarios in my system. Okay, anything else? No. Fine. Let me get into my system. So this is my system. Let me create, I think I have created a simple program. Excuse me. Yep. So here I'm going to use a local class, not an exception class, simple local class. Okay, so I'm going to, excuse me, raise an exception, standard exception. We'll see how it gets shot down. Then we'll see how to rectify it, how to capture it. Okay. So here I need one method. I can go with get in class, and class needs to be implementation, and method also to be implemented over here. And here I'm going to do excuse me, so local result is equal to 1 divided by 0. Okay, some hard-coded one. So in class, okay, it's done, and I need block. These are blocks, probably you might have aware of it. So I need events to write the code. So to access the class properties. So this is object of my class, local class. Okay, then I'm going to call the method. That is get. So here the exception is going to happen. Okay, I'm not explicitly raise an exception. So this is handled by standard exception classes. So this is going to raise an exception, and I didn't capture it. So here you can see the level 1 and level 2. So here level 1, I consider for my reference I'm saying. So level 1 is my program normal one, I'm calling the method, and level 2 probably where the exception is happening. So you have to capture either here or here. Okay, so then you are able to avoid the situation where the runtime error happens. So act toward it. So let's see. So we'll get a dump and execute. Yeah, so the dump is division by 0. So now we need to capture this. So exception is raised. It's well and good, but we need to capture. So most of the time, exception is how we are capturing. That is the way we have to work more. And because this is especially for the standard one, or the method which can be developed by someone else, could be a custom class, custom exception class and method, but we need to capture that as well. Okay, so now how to capture this, how to avoid actually, and this is the class they mentioned very clearly. This is the exception class which has been raised. Okay, so the step one, I'm going to capture it in the method itself. So change. So here I'm going to keep this as in the try one, try and catch. Catch cx underscore is y underscore divide. I didn't copy it from the dump. 1 second. So this is the exception. Copy this. So catch the exception which has been raised. 0. So if after you catch, what needs to be done? What kind of message you want to pass? I can say exception captured. Okay, and end catch, end try. Sorry, just close the block. So level 2, my understanding, level 2, I'm capturing the exception, Okay, let's see how it goes. Execute. It's done. Execute it. So now it shows very clearly exception captured. Okay, so at least we avoided the short dump in the flow of the program or an application. Now, if you want to have a standard message, this is a message which we are populating, but there is an option to get the message from the exception class itself. It could be a standard or it could be a custom. Whatever it is, there may be a option they are sending their own message. So how to capture it? So here I'm going to create an object for an exception class. So the object is technically called exception object. So here I'm going to use into data as we have on the flow declaration. I'm using that. Otherwise you have to declare an object, reference object over here before inside the method, type ref2 and for the particular exception class, and you can make use of it. Okay, so now let me have both statements. So data, I need a text, it's one variable, and there is a method which returns the text for the exception class. So that is nothing but get text. Okay. So get text, this is a method which responded what happens, the proper message statement from this exception class. Okay. So then I can say write and LV text, actual message from exception class. Okay. Activate it and then execute it. So now I'll get the exact message, division by 0. So you can concatenate with the other options. So exception happened, this is a message, whatever you need, depends on the requirement, you can do it. But this is a standard message for this exception. Division by 0 is an exception. Okay. So that's why you can able to use the exception object to read the information from the method. Now get into this exception class, just double click. Just go through the design of the exception class. It's same for all other exception classes. It could be a standard or it could be a custom, whatever it is, design is same. So this is a class, they mentioned very clearly, this is a class or interface. So start with CX, this is a class. And if you go to the properties, this is always any exception class is inherited by someone else, means some other exception class. So that is the design of any exception class. So here it is inherited from CX arithmetic error exception class. If you go further, it's coming under CX dynamic check. So it should be any of static, dynamic, or no check. Any of the superclass, this needs to be inherited. Okay, so that is the first step. First design you need to understand. And you have to go to the methods, whatever they have. So this is a get text. Okay, before that, I want to show you the interface. By default, you will get if underscore message is the interface. It carries a method called get text, get long text, and get source position. So mostly we are going to use get text where it returns if they maintain, that is very important. If they maintain a text in their exception class, definitely it will come. Most of the standard, yes, they maintained it. If some custom, they might maintain, they may not. So that is the reason if you're not getting any text, then the custom exception class is not maintain their messages. Okay. And the text, probably you will understand more about this area once we start working on the custom one. Okay, so here this is a message they mentioned clearly. This is the exceptions we raised, right? And division by 0. The name itself, exception ID is itself same. And here another ID, arithmetic error. So here they mention arithmetic error with operation ampersand operation, meaning dynamically we are dynamically they are populating the value. So you know about the message class, right? Same format they are using here. Okay, I will explain more about once you start creating the custom exception class. So this is the basic design of any exception class. So exception class has its own interfaces and has its own attributes. And here you can have more attributes, but for your custom exception class, you can have more attributes where dynamically you want to populate a value in the messages. And here you can have n number of exception ID. One exception class can have many exceptions IDs. Maybe you can gather all the relevant exceptions in one exception class, and you can have a different messages that able to passable. And the methods, default methods, if required, you can have your own methods also, if depends on your need. Okay, that's it about the design. Okay. Okay. Now level 2. Um, Sorry, this is level 2. Okay, my understanding. I'm going to use the same in my level 1. Okay, let's go here. So here I'm going to call the method where the exception is going to rise, and let me take out this. Okay, so level 2 is going to raise an exception, and I'm trying to capture in level 1. Okay, so now also you get a dump. Let's see why. Activate, execute, dump. Okay, saying very clearly the same message, division by 0, exception rise is not captured. When you mentioned, they mentioned very clearly was not caught in procedure. Here procedure is a generic term. It could be a method, it could be your program, whatever it is. It's a generic messages procedure. Okay, so what is the mistake? Or I missed one thing, meaning in the same place wherever the exception is raised, in the same place you capture the exception, we are good of all the designs. Okay, whatever we declared and everything is fine. But if the exception is going to captured outside of your method, then you need to add one thing in this method as rising. There's a small syntax to be added. Rising, this method is kind of a caption or information is going to be give for the people or for the person who's going to call this method. Okay, so this method is going to raise an exception, and an exception is this one. Okay, so this is one additional syntax to be added if the capture is outside of your method. Okay, so now there is no other change, only this I have added. I'm going to execute it. It's working fine. Okay, so you have to know very clearly when this rising is required. If the caption, if the exception is going to capture outside of your method, then only is required, otherwise this part is optional. Okay, so you should be very clear about this design, so then it's very easy to understand the entire design, which I'm going to explain in the next video. Got it? Okay, so now we are good. We learned about standard and with an exception object, message from the exception class, everything is fine. And level 1 and level 2 capture of the exception, and when we need the rising also, we are good enough. Now I'm going to create a custom exception class. So local custom exception class. So class, this is going to be exception definition. So I always mention it needs to be inherited from any one of the method. I'll go with static as of now, static check. Okay, and in class, because this is going to be a new method, right? So you can inherit from some other exception class as well, but I'll go with the cx static check exception class. So that's it. It doesn't require any implementation. Okay, only definition is more than enough. If you activate, it shows very clearly activated. If it is a normal class, definitely you will get a message. This class doesn't have a public section, it doesn't have a method information, so everything you will get as an error message, syntax error. But as an exception class, it won't. Okay, my exception class is ready to use it. So now I'm going to use it in my normal class. Let me have a different method for this. Okay, get data. Okay, let me have it rising as well, because I want to use I want to capture the exception outside of the method. So I'm going to use this rising option. Okay, and my method to be implemented, get data. So here I'm not going to use any other statements like select star from. The idea is if the data is not available, I'm going to raise an exception. So I simply go raise an exception. Okay, raise an exception and type as local exception class. Okay, so it has been raised and it needs to be captured as well. So let me have it here. So I'm going to try, and I'm going to call the method object get data. So if it is captured, I'm going to, sorry, if it is raised, I'm going to capture it. So name is exp. Okay, I don't have any messages over there, so I'm going to use simply my own statement, custom exception capture. Try is done. Okay, let's see how it behaves. Activated successfully, no issues, executed. So it shows very clearly this is for first method, exception capture division by 0, and this is for second exception. So custom exception also captured. Okay, so because it works fine, because I have declared or I have used the option rising, this method is going to rise an exception. That's why you are able to capture it outside of your method also. Okay, so this is a very simple way to create a custom exception class. I'm going to move further with a SE24 transaction because that is very simple to understand, very easy to not understand, very easy to add the message class, text and everything. Okay, so let me have a SE24 transaction. I'm going to create my own exception class. So class name, I'm trying to create a class name like this. We'll see what kind of error we are receiving. Exception class, create class, yes, going to create a class, and I'm going to make ABAP exception class, fill all record entries, okay. Exception class, then click save. So there is an error. The class name is not permitted for the class type you have chosen. So class type is exception class. So any exception class should start with CX only. If it is a custom, it should be ZCX or YCX. Okay. And you can say save it again. Now it's fine. By default, it takes superclass is static. If you want, you can change it here, dynamic, no check, or some other exception class as well. Okay. An exception with message class, I'm creating that also. Click save. Okay, local object. Done. By default, because already it has been added what is the super class name, and here you have an option to change that also. If you want to just click change, you can change it. So if you want dynamic or static or no check, okay. So there's an option to change in this properties tab. And then interface, it already added message and T100 message. T100 is a table name where you're able to read the message from that table. And this is another interface method to populate a message as well as to read the message from your exception class. And attributes, currently we have few and you can add, we'll add it later. And text is a place where you can add the different text of different exceptions, okay. And methods, the same thing, default methods, if you want to add, you can add your own as well. So now I'm not going to add anything. Let me call this from my program. Let's see how it begins. There is no difference, but let's call it first. So this is the exception. Okay, now go to my program. Okay, so let me have one more method. So the method would be what do you call, get data. Okay, get sales. So here also I'm going to write, because sometimes what happens, by default we can add this statement, because sometimes if this exception is going to be used by some other developer, they might be use or try to capture the exception outside of the method only. Okay, so that is the reason by default we are using rising option in the declaration of your method. Okay, safer side. So here this is the raised and this method to be implemented. I'm not adding any logic here because logic, it depends on your need. So you can write a logic and raise an exception with the help of if condition, key statement, whatever it is. Exception and type is this one in method. So same thing, I'm going to capture it. So here it's going to be a different method name, sales, and my exception class name, exception, the name, yeah, exception class, CLSS. Okay, so it's a global custom SE24 custom exception captured. Okay, add to it. Capture ZGA EXP class. Is it active? Okay. Okay, this is spelling. CX. Try to act toward it. That's good. Execute. Done. So global AC24 exception captured. So now I'm going to add a message. So go to your SE24 and everything is done in place, especially the method, interface and everything. So go to text. So this is a place where you're going to have a text. Okay. So now I'm going to have a text over here. Like you can have exception ID also, you can able to use it, or you can create your own IDs like sales order not available, sales type is not, depends on your need. You can you can add number of exceptions. Okay. So let me have it. So for that I need a message class. So I have already created a message class, IC91, and my message class name is, I think this one, nope, see message class, yeah, let me have this. So data not found, invalid entry. So let me go with 000 first. So go to my 24 and keep the cursor which exception ID you are going to add a messages, your own message. So click message text. It will ask what is the message class name, CGI message class, and what is the number you're going to provide it, 000. And here I'm not going to use anything. Okay, I'm not going to use any attribute. It's a static message. Click change, done. Mention what is the text, data not found, act toward it. Now this is going to be raised, or this is going to be added whenever you are raise an exception. It's not for capture. Once you, because in this particular scenario you have three different exceptions in the same exception class. So you have to mention clearly exception 1, this is a message, exception 2, this is a message, exception 3, this is an exception ID. So that way you have to raise an exception. Okay. So now we are going to use an option called pattern. Instead of raising exception, just like raise exception type. Now, if you have a message classes or if you have a parameters to be included while raising an exception, better option is go to pattern. Control F6, ABAP object patterns, and raise an exception and exception name. So my exception is ZCX exception class, ZCX exception class, enter. So by default, you will get this exporting options. So that is the reason. So let me command this. So what is a text ID? So text ID is your exception class. So this is an exception class. And these are the exceptions IDs you are getting. Like you are getting everything. And one of the thing is this is also an exception ID because I mentioned the same name, right? The default one I have used it. I don't want anything previous. So that you have to use it. Let me show you once again. So default one. Once you create the different, I will show you that as well. Okay, so this is the ID and it's coming under this exception class. So we are done. Okay, this is raised. This has been raised with the own message. Now, again, it's optional only for the people who are accessing our method. If they want, they really, then you have to create it using a exception object. So this is an exception. You can say sales object. Okay, so let me have the code as well. That's fine. I want text equal to exception sales object, and the method is get text. Okay, done. So I'm going to have both messages also. One is hard coded message, one is message from the exception class. Okay, act toward it and execute. So data not found. So this is the hard coded one. Global AC24 custom exception capture, data not found is also coming. Suppose if you have more than one exception ID under the exception, same exception class, you can have it. You can say invalid data. Just to create it. This is a creation of exception ID. These are exception IDs. And here I can say message text is going to be the same one, probably 001. So still I'm not using any attributes. Click save change, act ordered. So you can use this exception maybe in the same method or a different method, depends on your need. So let me have it in the same method. So let me comment this because exception is only one. Excuse me. You can have a number of exception depends on the conditions. So here I'm not having any conditions, just hard coded it, right? So that is the reason I'm commenting this. I will show you how to raise multiple exceptions and how to capture the same in your exceptions capture place as well. Exception class, and here is going to be again your exception ID and then invalid data. So this is the exception ID. Okay, exception class and exception ID. Act over that and execute. So it's invalid entry. So previously it shows no data found, it's an invalid entry. Now if you want to pass a message, like dynamically if you want to pass some values to this message, then you're able to make it. First go to your message class and give a change. So invalid entry, ampersand 1, so ampersand 1, like position 1. Okay, first to change. And second change is go to your class, exception class, have attribute first to receive the values. I can say data, data to display. Okay, so okay, data to receive. So some values. So this is going to be an instant attribute and the public, and then I can say I'm an attributes tab. Okay, it's not a message attributes, simple attributes, and it could be character 20. Okay, then save it. Go to text. I'm going to modify the existing one. If you want to add, you can add it. And here show message text and select the attribute. So data to receive and change. So now you're able to see, right? Invalid entry and whatever entry is coming from the people who are calling this method, that is going to be dynamically populated in this message. Act toward it. Okay, so now go to the program. So here list out the attribute name. So what is the attribute name? Data to receive. Okay, so equal to, I'm just giving 12. So here don't use exporting or importing option, don't use brackets. Once you give bracket, system recognize this is a method, but this is not a method, this is an exception ID. So if the exception ID has a parameter needs to be passed, then just give the parameters, maybe more than one parameter, just list out over here. So don't use any bracket or export import option, you will get a syntax error. Okay, so here I'm hard coding it, but based on your need you can have a parameter, means method parameter. When calling the method, pass the message, pass the values to that, and using the parameter you can pass to the exception ID values as well. Okay, act toward it and execute now. So you'll get 12. Okay, so this is a way you are able to pass a dynamic excuse me, dynamic values to your exception messages as well. Okay, so you can create n number of message class exceptions, so you can capture n number of exception, but it needs to be meaning same method you are able to have more than one exception to be raised, but it depends on the scenario, only one exception to be raised inside your method. For example, let me show you, like if 1 equal to 1 this, okay, or some conditions, else if like 1 equal to 2, for example, I'm saying, and so here one exception to be raised and another one you want to raise it, so you can raise other exceptions, maybe a different exception, it could be lc underscore exception, so I think that is a local one. So this is a way you are able to raise more than one exception in your method. Few things to be changed or added in the declaration of your message. So because I have two exceptions, it could be called or captured outside of my method. So to avoid the short dump, let me have the exceptions, whatever I have listed out in my method, I'm going to add it in my declaration of my method or definition of my method. So I have added here. And finally, how to capture it? That is also very simple. So this is the one, right? So let me catch LC exception. I can say write multiple exception scenario captured, whatever it is. Okay. So let me have underline here. So it's easy to see the output in active order. Just activate this and execute. Oh, very good. Display errors. What is the error? I'm sorry, it's not a U line, it's SYU line. SYU line. Okay, activate. I think it's going to capture any one of the exceptions. Okay, and it could be the second one, I believe. Yes. Global SE24 is captured because that is the way I have written the code. So let me change the code over here. So 1 equal to 2, and I can say it's 1 equal to 1. So just have your own scenarios here. So now the local exception is going to call and execute. Yeah, there's multiple exception scenario called. Clear? So this is a way you are able to have multiple exceptions in one method, and the same way you're able to call multiple catches under one try and end try block. So hope this might be useful for you about the exceptions. Now you have an idea about what is the exception, how to capture, what are the ways to capture, and what is the hierarchy level to capture the exceptions. Just play around, and if you have any doubt, let me know. And the next video would be the design of the exception in object oriented ABAP. Okay, thank you so much for your time, and see you in the next video. Bye.